Before we start, I'd just like to give a shout out to the following people for supporting Stories Telling Stories on Patreon: Jim Ross, Holly, and Tamara. Thank you so much for your support. If you'd like to help support the show and hear your name listed before future episodes, head on over to patreon.com/storiestelling-stories. Howdy, howdy, ladies and gentlemen. We are back here again, and we're up to episode 6 of Locked in a Vacancy. And I apologize in advance in this episode if there are things popping up in the background that take you out of the moment. They have begun to lift very lightly, the restrictions on public gatherings and whatnot, at least around here. And they've made it so that you are allowed to meet with groups of 10 people or less from other households, as long as the people you're meeting with have been practicing safe social distancing and everything like that. And they recommend that you do these meetings outside rather than going to someone's house. So there is one of these meetings happening on the other side of the window from where I'm sitting right now, and it is very loud. I've been looking for a bit of motivation to get me to move my podcast recording setup out of my work office and into a smaller secondary office I want to assemble in my bedroom. Because my bedroom is what used to be my studio, and when I built that, I actually put in sound treatment insulation in the walls. So that's what I made it for. But long story short, I got sick of living in a small room, which is now my office, and I switched them around. And for the most part, it's fine, but the stuff that I have to hear from outside while I'm trying to do my job, or when I'm trying to do something like this and just record, where silence is important, I feel that overweighs having a one-stop shop of an office where I do everything. Anyway, I didn't mean to go on a rant just now, but that's the way it is. So here we are, episode 6, and we're examining a work by an author who, to be completely honest, I know nothing about going into it. I've done a bit of research just so that I'd have something to say, and he's kind of a fascinating figure, this Ambrose Bierce. He is apparently regarded as one of the most influential journalists in the United States, at least in his day, and he's held in a regard in terms of horror writing alongside Edgar Allan Poe and H.P. Lovecraft. Surprisingly surprising to me, having never heard of this guy. But I guess he was a pioneer of realist fiction, and he was also a respected and feared literary critic. So this guy seemed to have done it all. And almost as intriguing and interesting as to what he accomplished in life is the fact that his death is just as questionable and interesting. Being a man who really wanted to get up close with his subject matter, he took off to Mexico during the Mexican Revolution because he wanted to experience the revolution for himself. He was rumored to be traveling with some rebel troops in the Chihuahua area of Mexico, and he disappeared. No one knows what happens to him. No one ever saw him again. And that's kind of the end of his story. At 71 years old, he just goes to Mexico because there's a war. I want to see what's going on. So, yeah. Definitely an interesting mind in this man, and we're going to dive into one of his lesser-known stories today. Of all the stuff he's written, this is probably the one that gets looked at the least, so I felt that it garnered a little special attention here on Locked in a Vacancy. So with that, we're going to dive into The Boarded Window, one of Ambrose Bierce's short horror stories. You be the judge of that. I'm just here to reenact it for you. I am Eric Hill, and this is The Boarded Window by Ambrose Bierce on Locked in a Vacancy. In 1830, only a few miles away from what is now the great city of Cincinnati, lay an immense and almost unbroken forest. The whole region was sparsely settled by people of the frontier, restless souls who no sooner had honed fairly habitable homes out of the wilderness and attained to that degree of prosperity which today we should call indulgence, than impelled by some mysterious impulse of their nature, they abandoned all and pushed farther westward to encounter new perils and privations in the efforts to regain the meager comforts which they had voluntarily renounced. Many of them had already forsaken that region for the remoter settlements, but among those remaining was one who had been of those first arriving. He lived alone in a house of logs, surrounded on all sides by the great forest, of whom gloom and silence he seemed a part, for no one had ever known him to smile, nor speak a needless word. His simple wants were supplied by the sale or barter of skins of wild animals in the river town, for not a thing did he grow upon the land which, if needful, he might have claimed by right of undisturbed possession. There were evidences of improvement. A few acres of ground immediately about the house had once been cleared of its trees, the decaying stumps of which were half concealed by the new growth that had been suffered to repair the ravage wrought by the axe. Apparently, the man's zeal for agriculture had burned with a failing flame, expiring in penitential ashes. The little log house, with its chimney of sticks, its roof of warped clapboards, weighted with traversing poles, and its chinking of clay, had a single door, and directly opposite, a window. The latter, however, was boarded up. Nobody could remember a time when it was not, and none knew why it was so closed. Certainly not because of the occupant's dislike of light and air, for those on rare occasions when a hunter had passed that lonely spot, the recluse had commonly been seen sunning himself on his doorstep, if heaven had provided sunshine for his need. I fancy there are a few persons living today who ever knew the secret of that window, but I am one, as you shall see. The man's name was said to be Murlock. He was apparently 70 years old, actually about 50. Something besides years had had a hand in his aging. His hair and long, full beard were white, his gray, lusterless eyes sunken. His face singularly seamed with wrinkles, which appeared to belong to two intersecting systems. In figure he was tall and spare, with a stoop of the shoulders, a burden-bearer. I never saw him. These particulars I learned from my grandfather, from whom also I got the man's story when I was a lad. He had known him when living nearby in that early day. One day, Murlock was found in his cabin, dead. It was not a time and place for coroners and newspapers, and I suppose it was agreed that he had died of natural causes, or I should have been told and should remember. I only know that with what was probably a sense of the fitness of things, the body was buried near the cabin, alongside the grave of his wife, who had predeceased him by so many years that local tradition had retained hardly a hint of her existence. That closes the final chapter of this story true, excepting, indeed, the circumstance that many years afterwards, in company with an equally intrepid spirit, I penetrated to the place and ventured near enough to the ruined cabin to throw a stone against it, and ran away to avoid the ghost whichever well-informed boy thereafter knew haunted the spot. But there is an earlier chapter that's supplied by my grandfather. When Murdoch built his cabin and began laying sturdily about with his axe to hoe out a farm, the rifle, meanwhile, his means of support, he was young, strong, and full of hope. In that eastern country whence he came, he had married, as was the fashion, a young woman in all ways worthy of his honest devotion, who shared the dangers and privations of his lot with a willing spirit and light heart. There is no known record of her name, of her charms of mind and person. Tradition is silent, and the doubter is at liberty to entertain his doubt, but God forbid that I should share it. Of their affection and happiness there is abundant assurance in every added day of the man's widowed life, for what but the magnetism of a blessed memory could have chained that venturesome spirit to a lot like that? One day, Murdoch returned from gunning in a distant part of the forest to find his wife prostrate with fever and delirious. There was no physician within miles, no neighbor, nor was she in a condition to be left to summon help. So he set about the task of nursing her back to health, but at the end of the third day she fell into unconsciousness and so passed away, apparently with never a gleam of returning reason. From what we know of a nature like this, we may venture to sketch in some of the details of the outline picture drawn by my grandfather. When convinced that she was dead, Murlock had sense enough to remember that the dead must be prepared for burial. In performance of this sacred duty, he blundered now and again, did certain things incorrectly, and others, which he did correctly, were done over and over. His occasional failures to accomplish some simple and ordinary act filled him with astonishment, like that of a drunken man who wonders at the suspension of familiar natural laws. He was surprised, too, that he did not weep. Surprised and a little ashamed. Surely it is unkind not to weep for the dead.
"Tomorrow," he said aloud, "I shall have to make the coffin and dig the grave, and then I shall miss her, when she is no longer in sight. But now, she is dead, of course, but it is all right. It must be all right, somehow. Things cannot be so bad as they seem."
He stood over the body in the fading light, adjusting the hair and pulling the finishing touches to the simple toilet, doing all mechanically, with soulless care. And still, through his consciousness ran an undersense of conviction that all was right, that he should have her again as before, and everything explained. He had had no experience in grief. His capacity had not been enlarged by use. His heart could not contain it all, nor his imagination rightly conceive it. He did not know he was so hard struck. That knowledge would come later and never go. Grief is an artist of powers as various as the instruments upon which he plays his dirges for the dead, evoking for some the sharpest, shrillest notes, for others the low, grave chords that throb recurrent like the slow beating of a distant drum. Some natures it startles, some it stupefies. To one it comes like the stroke of an arrow, stinging all the sensibilities to a keener life. To another as the blow of a bludgeon, which it crushes, benumbs. We may conceive Murlock to have been that way affected, and we are upon sure ground that we may have conjectured, no sooner that he had finished his pious work than, sinking into a chair by the side of the table upon which the body lay, and noting how white the profile showed in the deepening gloom, he laid his arms upon the table's edge and dropped his face into them, tearless yet and unutterably weary. At that moment came in through the window a long wailing sound, like the cry of a lost child in the far deeps of the darkening wood. But the man did not move. Again, and nearer than before, sounded that unearthly cry upon his failing sense. Perhaps it was a wild beast. Perhaps it was a dream, for Murloc was asleep. Some hours later, as it afterward appeared, this unfaithful watcher awoke and lifted his head from his arms, intently listened. He knew not why. There in the black darkness by the side of the dead, recalling all without a shock, he strained his eyes to see, he knew not what. His senses were all alert. His breath was suspended. His blood had stilled its tides as if to assist the silence. Who, what had waked him? And where was it? Suddenly, the table shook beneath his arms, and at the same moment he heard, or fancied that he heard, a light, soft step. Another. Sounds as of bare feet upon the floor. He was terrified beyond the power to cry out or move. Perforce he waited. Waited there in the darkness, though seemingly centuries of such dread had one may know, yet lived to tell. He tried vainly to speak the dead woman's name, vainly to stretch forth his hand across the table to learn if she were there. His throat was powerless. His arms and hands were like lead. Then occurred something more frightful. Some heavy body seemingly hurled against the table with an impetus that pushed it against his breast so sharply as nearly to overthrow him. And at the same instant, he heard and felt the fall of something upon the floor with so violent a thump that the whole house was shaken by the impact. A scuffling ensued, and a confusion of sounds impossible to describe. Murloc had risen to his feet. Fear had by excess forfeited control of his faculties. He flung his hands upon the table. Nothing was there. There is a point at which terror may turn to madness, and madness incites to action. With no definite intent, from no motive but the wayward impulse of a madman, Murloc sprang to the wall. With a little groping, seized his loaded rifle, and without aim, discharged it. By the flash which lit up the room, with a vivid illumination, he saw an enormous panther dragging the dead woman towards the window, its teeth fixed in her throat. There they were, darkness, blacker than before, and silence. And when he returned to consciousness, the sun was high, and the wood vocal with songs of birds. The body lay near the window, where the beast had left it when frightened away by the flash and the report of the rifle. The clothing was deranged, the long hair in disorder. The limbs lay anyhow. From the throat, dreadfully lacerated, had issued a pool of blood not yet entirely coagulated. The ribbon with which he had bound the wrists was broken. The hands were tightly clenched. Between the teeth was a fragment of the animal's ear. The end. Locked in a Vacancy is produced in collaboration with Stories Telling Stories and STS Media Group, socially isolating itself at Milt House Studios in Milton, Vermont, casting around the globe to your frontal lobe wherever podcasts are found. Locked in a Vacancy is also streaming on YouTube at Stories Telling Stories. Make sure to give us a review wherever you stream our show. We really appreciate it. Make sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram, give us a subscribe on YouTube, and consider supporting us on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. And until next time, stay sane, stay safe, and stay whimsical.